When we think about games with amazing storylines, one that might not come to mind immediately is Dark Souls. In fact, when we think about the story of Dark Souls, some ways to describe it could be obtuse, hidden, or withheld. So then, if Dark Souls has such a hidden storyline that's out of view from the common player, then why has it become so beloved? Today I want to answer that question and break down why I think Dark Souls has some of the best storytelling in video games. There's a rule within the author community about writing a book and how to captivate the reader into an amazing story without the use of oversaturated exposition. And if you don't know what exposition means, that's basically telling the player or the reader what's going on in the world and what they should be concerned about in terms of the story. And the rule of this in storytelling is to show rather than tell. For example, if I was writing a book and I was describing a man in a wet black cloak, I wouldn't want to say that the man was wearing a wet black cloak, but rather I would want to show the reader by saying that the moonlight glinted off the man's cloak and water dripped onto the floor beneath him, a remnant of the heavy rain of the night. Now, as you can see with that, I've created a much more dynamic scene by showing the reader the visual aspects of what's happening rather than just telling them about the man's wet cloak. And this same rule can be applied to video games, and I believe the Dark Souls games and From Software are masters at achieving this exact rule in the video games that they create. There's a particular part of the game that really stood out to me that achieved perfect environmental storytelling, and that's the introduction to Ulasil in the DLC in Dark Souls 1. When we start the DLC, we're transported to this world of Ulasil in a forest that's fallen to the abyss. But the game doesn't tell us that, rather it shows us. We see the markings of the abyss staining the ground and the dark smoke rising from the chasms around us. The forest is disheveled, weeds are growing up from the ground, vines are falling from the trees, and the workers, rather than fixing this with their tools, are turned around to kill using their tools as weapons rather than growth. The forest guardians are not worried about the infection that's spreading across the ground, but are instead trying to ward off trespassers and people that might tread upon their village. And by showing us all this, Dark Souls creates an immersive world where the player wants to learn more. It doesn't force feed it down our throats with words and exposition, but rather lets us experience it firsthand and ask the questions of our own volition. And because of this, the story is much more impactful, memorable, and dynamic. And what this experience in the Dark Forest leads to is another fantastic example of Dark Souls storytelling. Artorias is probably the most popular character in all of Dark Souls. He looks awesome, fights crazy, and he's this legendary hero that all the other characters have been hyping up throughout the game. But it's not any of those things that make him so popular, it's his story. But if we think critically about his story for a moment, it's nothing too profound. He was a knight of Gwyn sent to purge the abyss and stop the spread throughout the land. But when he arrived there, he succumbed to the power of the abyss and lost himself to its curse. It's an interesting take on the quote that inspired a lot of Dark Souls. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. The story of Artorias is honestly very cool, but I don't think it's powerful enough to rank him at the #1 spot as the most powerful character. But what other aspects of the story create this extreme love for this character? Now, there is a little exposition in the game that tells us about Artorias, but it's what we experience throughout the world that really makes this so much better. We see the impact that he had through the dialogue that the other characters share. We see the massive gravestone that his pet is guarding, even though he knows it's a false grave. And then when we reach Ulasil, we see the trail of the abyss leading to the Colosseum where we have our battle. And then when we find him, we don't find this legendary hero of light and power that he represents, but rather a fallen and corrupted version of what once was. You see, it's not the use of exposition and telling that makes us love Artorias so much, it's what we experience and see for ourselves in the game that makes him that much cooler. If the DLC for Dark Souls didn't exist and we never had this battle, Artorias would not be nearly as popular as he is, even though we have his full story told to us through the item descriptions of the main game. And it's this use of showing rather than telling that makes the player feel that much more accomplished when they figure out the story of what's going on, rather than just having it spoon-fed through an expositional cutscene. Dark Souls' story is obtuse, it's hidden from the player, it causes us to work to figure out what's going on, and that is why the players that do figure it out love it so much. And also due to this work to figuring it out, it establishes a connection to the player, and it gives them that personal satisfaction that really implements them into the character that they're playing as, and immerses them deeply almost to the point where it feels real, as a self-sustaining entity, with a story that's continuing past the game. There's another example of excellent showing rather than telling in another From Software game that I really want to dive into, and that is the rivalry between Sekiro and Genichiro. When we first meet Genichiro, we don't know anything about him before this event, aside from a couple characters mentioning his name, but we have no history, no exposition, no story for this guy, yet the simple look that he gives us tells it all. We see him standing on this hill and he's this imposing figure, casting down a shadow on us. We see the uneasiness in Kuro, and that tells us that there's a history here. They know who this is. And when Wolf blocks Kuro with his arm and begins to draw his sword, that tells us that Wolf knows the situation, knows who this is, and knows what he's capable of. And by Kuro saying thank you, we know that Genichiro's intentions aren't good. And even though he has bad intentions, Kuro still addresses him as Lord. So that tells us that there's a connection here as well, and that Genichiro holds authority over Kuro in more than just a way of knowing him. And all of this is established by just a few actions and no use of exposition. And when Wolf and Genichiro begin to fight, and Genichiro cuts off Wolf's arm, the quote that matters here is that a shinobi should know the difference between victory and honor. And this quote really stands out too because it establishes that Genichiro would rather have honor, but there's something much larger at stake that caused him to throw that aside in order to gain the victory in the battle. And we can see when he says that the divine heir is coming with me, he doesn't turn to meet Wolf's eyes, he turns his back, signaling that this is something he doesn't want to do. And it's this amazing use of storytelling that makes the From Software games so good and so rich. They don't need this deep exposition that takes away from the gameplay to really flesh out the world and create an engaging story. They're masters at creating these stories that the player can figure out as they go. And it's this level of immersion that gives the player satisfaction and really creates a world that they want to be in and learn more about. And that is what makes From Software games storytelling so amazing. But guys, that's going to pretty much do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave a like if you did and subscribe if you're not already, and I'll catch you in the next one.